So welcome everyone. The aim of this particular session is to go over assessment task 2. So what I'll do is I will talk for a little bit at the start. We'll look at the rubric and the instructions, and then I'll open it up and you can ask me any questions that you've got. And then there will be a recording made, and I'll post it in 2 sections. I'll post it in the live session section, but I'll also post it in the assessment discussion forum, so you can go back to it and have a look at it as well. So with this assessment task, what we're trying to do is get a nice balance between showing that you've mastered theory, but also you can apply that theory into the setting that you're working in. So for most of you, you're in schools, so we'd strongly encourage you to use the setting that you're in. And of course, we ask that you de-identify it. So don't name it at all or provide information that makes it really obvious about which school you're in. If you're not in a school, and I know there are some of you who are not in schools, you could either think of a school that you've previously worked in or you're familiar with. And if that really isn't possible, then I'd suggest you create a school context. So you create that persona of the school so that you can do that. So there's different levels, I think, for most of you that you are actually in those school settings. About this actual assessment task, what it is, it's a persuasive piece of writing. And so the aim of it is to write an evidence-based, academically robust proposal that you could submit to your school leadership team. And what you need to, or school council, so leadership team, school council. So if it's going to the school council, you need to be mindful that typically a school council is made up of people who aren't educators. So when you're articulating the ideas in your proposal, it's actually really important to keep that in mind. We actually know that some past students have actually submitted their proposals that they wrote in this subject to their leadership team or their school councils. So it is something that you might find actually practical, something that's useful for you. But we're not saying that you have to submit it. What we don't want you to do in this assessment task is to write about everything that we've covered. There's a lot of things that we've covered in quite a bit of detail that are quite high level. So for example, the psychometric properties of assessments, you don't need to include that detail, but it's important that you understand those concepts as you're writing. So what you are doing is telling the readers of this proposal about the MTSS framework. So you need to say what it is. You need to say how it works and why it's important. You need to explain why it will be good for your school if it's implemented well. And you need to be considering the data that's been collected and used, which will show improved student outcomes in academic achievement, well-being, maybe also teacher satisfaction, and how you build that school community. It's important that you've also got some understanding of some specific instructions, I guess, around this task. So please do actually read the assessment task 2 detailed guidelines, and I will bring that up on the screen a little bit later. And also Pam's got a link to her hot tips for academic writing, so please have a look at that as well. There are certainly some very clear guidelines about what to do and what to avoid. What I would like to do is give you a little bit of preemptive feedback. So some things to really to have to the fore as you're writing your proposal. So I wanted to try and think of it mainly from the point of view of what a well-written proposal looks like. So really thinking about that. So a well-written proposal will reference any statements that are made with some robust evidence. So if you make a claim, you need to be able to back that up. Otherwise, if you're making a claim and you're not backing it up, we're presuming that that's your idea. But it's not robust because, like, well, how do we know that that works? So for example, if you wanted to make a statement around explicit instruction being the most effective approach for novices as they're learning new knowledge and skills, you would reference authors such as John Hattie with his meta-analysis. If you don't reference an idea, you're saying it's actually your idea. And that can be problematic also from the point of plagiarism. So in academic writing, the referencing is really important. And of course, if you want to score more highly in terms of the referencing, This is where you would synthesize your findings. So this is where if you've made a statement, but you found that there are actually 2 or 3 different journal articles that are showing the same findings, you would then reference all 3 of those in brackets after the statement that you've made. What we know too is the references are there to back up your arguments. So remember, it's a persuasive piece, and they're not there as fillers. So we're not going to, we don't want you to just throw references in because it looks good that you've got lots of references. They actually need to be really intentional and purposeful. Of course, when we're thinking about referencing, it's important to know the APA 7 conventions. So there are there are links through the La Trobe Library, but also if you just Google APA 7 conventions, there are lots of different websites that provide some really good examples, and it might be occasionally you need to reference something that's a little bit different. So go in and check. Don't ever just go, I think it's like this. Go in and be very precise. And I know that sometimes when I'm checking a reference, if I have a slightest bit of doubt, I always go and check it to make sure where did the italics go, where do I use capitals, and all of those really important conventions. What a well-written proposal will do, or not do, it won't reference the lectures. That's really important. You're not to reference me or Pam, okay? Unless Pam, you're referencing an article that she's actually written. That's another thing. You also need to make sure that the majority of your references are recent academic literature. But we also know if you're wanting to reference something that's like seminal work, it might be something that's quite old because that's where that original theory has come from. You might include some government documents and maybe 1 or 2 blogs, but really we want you to be looking at that academic literature for your referencing. When you also, this is linked with your referencing, is be really mindful about quotes. So be really sparing in your use of quotes, or perhaps preferably don't even use them. They need to have a really clear purpose. Otherwise, they'll be seen as a filler and trying to build up your word count. If you do happen to use a direct quote because you've found one that really needs to be shared, you have to include the page number as well as the author or authors and the year of publication. That's really important. If, however, you're paraphrasing information, that's where your referencing is only the authors and the year. Another thing to consider is the tone of your writing. So that's really important. So you're writing a proposal, but it should have an academic tone. You can use first person though, but it should be quite clinical and objective and not have any emotive language in it. And you're always writing using the evidence base. So when we think about the actual focus, well, in terms of your content, it's really important that even if you want to focus on response to intervention, which we have covered, it's been a big focus for us in the subject, you need to ensure that you discuss MTSS and each of the components. That's really important, and that you reference those as well. If you're going to talk about response to intervention as your key focus, make sure you signpost that right at the start as you're introducing your proposal. So you might say, we're going to talk about MTSS and why, the importance of implementing MTSS, but with a particular focus on response to intervention. And then you might even go further and say, and it's got an emphasis on literacy. And this will be appropriate for a lot of you because most of you are actually in the language and literacy stream. So you need to highlight that, and again, highlight that right at the start. But also maybe note that MTSS also applies to numeracy and other curriculum areas, but you are keeping your focus on literacy, for example. A small little comment which definitely relates to, I know I've heard Pam talk about this quite a few times, but try avoiding anthropomorphism. So that's where you actually give a human quality to a non-human object. So rather than, for example, writing that the MTS framework does something, the framework doesn't something, you might talk about how implementation impacts student outcomes. So that's just like a little piece to remember. When we look at the rubric, there'll actually be 4 key areas that you're going to be marked on. So the first one is about actually, can you demonstrate that you really understand, know and understand the content that actually relates to this topic? So through your proposal, are you showing that you understand what MTSS is? Are you showing that you understand what progress monitoring is, the principles of progress monitoring? Are you demonstrating the importance of, what the tiers mean, that they're additive, that they're not either or, so on. So that's where that mark for the content will come from. Then you've got macro elements of the proposal. So this is actually the degree to which your writing has like a logical sequence and is accessible to the reader. So again, this is where you need to remember all the way along who your audience is. So your audience isn't me. Your audience is actually your school leadership team or your school council. And again, as I said at the start, your audience they're either possibly people who don't have a background in education or certainly don't have a background in MTSS and perhaps science of learning. When we look at micro elements, this is where we're looking at things like spelling, grammar, punctuation. And so good academic writers will use complete sentences. They'll avoid sentence fragments and run-on sentences. And I know from marking assignments in other subjects, the run-on sentence you need to be really careful about. So when you're doing some proofreading, have a look and see, have you got lots of ands in that sentence or ands and becauses, and see where there's a point that you can perhaps split a long sentence into 2 shorter ones. I did mention referencing just at the start, but I would like to reiterate some points in terms of referencing. So a well-written article will demonstrate an ability to back up arguments with robust evidence. They will use the correct APA 7 academic referencing conventions. And this is also picking out a couple of things, using when to use the word and when to use the ampersand when you're referencing. So when you're talking about let's say you're talking about Hattie and O'Leary within the text, you would write the word and. But if you were talking about something and then referencing in brackets Hattie and O'Leary, you would use an ampersand. So Hattie ampersand O'Leary. So again, that's all part of those APA 7 conventions, but it's something I have noticed as an area that you need to be particularly mindful of. And that can often be what really differentiates a submission, the way the referencing is done. When we think about the data that you might include, so maybe you might want to include some NAPLAN data. Remember, whatever you include, it can't identify your school, so that's really important. It should only be included if it's actually relevant to what you're talking about. So don't put it in just because you feel you need to share some data. And you need to have it represented in a way that's really easy to understand. So really clear in terms of how you're labeling a table or a figure and being clear about what information is being shown. And to remember that maximum 2 figures to be used in your submission. So don't use an appendix with a whole lot of other data. That we don't want to see that. When we think about the context, so again, at the start, I talked about, for most of you, we would really encourage you to use the school context you're currently in. If you're not in a school at the moment, use a school that you have worked in, or maybe a school that you're really familiar with. And if you're really stuck and you don't have a school that you've worked in or one that you're familiar with, then create a persona. So you might say, okay, this is a primary school. It's this sort of demographic. It's got 500 students. So actually, like, write down and create your school persona so that you can work with that. But I would imagine there shouldn't be too many of you who are needing to do that for this particular assignment. But what's really important is that you're constantly connecting your context to the different components of MTS and the arguments that you're making. So it's about implementation in your context. So that's really important. Don't just mention it occasionally. It's about mentioning perhaps there's already things that are in place, and maybe it's about really not maybe it's about what's the impact that the implementation of MTS is likely to have in on the students for the students in that particular context that you've outlined. So if I think about a few little writing tips, um, some this is some don'ts rather than just some do's, but don't use dot points. Okay, so all has to be complete sentences, no dot points. And also don't use any contractions. So no don'ts or I'm or isn't. They need to be expanded, is not, will not, so on. Make sure you're using apostrophes correctly. So if you're not using contractions, therefore the apostrophe or contraction shouldn't exist. And you probably won't have too many apostrophes to use anyway, but apostrophes are never a part of plurals, as in how you spell a particular word's plural. I know that there was a question in one of my tutorials about spacing because of being told to write everything with 1.5 line spacing. And so I just want to clarify that we also want you to have the 1.5 spacing within your reference list, even though APA 7 will say like double spacing, but 1.5 consistently throughout your proposal. To also note that your reference list is what you have referred to in your proposal. We don't want a bibliography. So a bibliography is a reading list. This is what you've read. But it might be that you've read articles or books that you actually don't reference in your proposal. So we don't actually want to know that. We just want to know what's in your writing. So of course at the end what you need to be really careful about is making sure, have I actually got every single thing that I've referenced in my reference list? And everything in my reference list, does it actually appear in my writing? And to be, if you're using EndNote or something else, just to still go in and check that the conventions are correct, that you've got the hanging indent in your reference list. So often you'll find that it's all those end checkings that sometimes can take as long as the actual writing of the proposal. It's all the little checks, but they're super important. What else? In terms of sometimes people ask about the word count and say, how we know it's a 3,000 word, which you've got a 10% leeway either way. But in terms of how much in the introduction or how much in different sections, there are different ways that you can approach writing this, but the only thing I would say is don't use too many words in your introduction. So keep your introduction really nice and clear and to the point. But what you might like to do as you're planning is to write some headings, or I'll often pose questions. So, what is MTSS? How does responsive intervention fit? Why is progress monitoring important? What sorts of impacts would we expect to see? So if you write those questions, you could use those questions as your headings within your proposal, but also use them to really plan out what it is that you want to be talking about. It's really important, please don't put a table of contents or an abstract. That's all outlined in the guidelines, but it's not that type of academic piece. Also, if there's not any particular way to plan. So just because I've given you an example of how you might plan there, I've also planned things where I've mind mapped stuff. Some of you might like to use, if you're really familiar with the Writing Revolution, you might actually like to use their multiple paragraph planning. So there's lots of different ways, but it's good to start really broadly. So, for example, what's the current situation in terms of if you're looking at literacy in Australia, then introduce your context, then present your solution. So you're gradually getting really down to the specifics of your context. And then, of course, what you need to do is say, well, why this solution and what is it and how do we implement it? You also very much need to think about what are some of the challenges that might arise so that you can address that. What are some real key considerations in this implementation? It's also good to think about, well, what's needed in terms of investment. And investment might mean time, it might mean people, it might mean physical resources. And then what sort of commitment are you looking for in terms of having a sustainable implementation? And there you will find there are particular points through your proposal, particularly if you're focusing on response to intervention, where you can reference those other elements of MTS. So where teamwork comes in and reference that that is one of the elements of or components of MTSS, or where staff professional learning comes in, or where our curriculum design. So that's where you can constantly make those links to MTSS, even if you're actually really looking at one particular component. Last little thing is, if you're new to academic writing or you're still developing those skills, there is certainly support that you can access through La Trobe. So look for that support. But I think for now, I know there's one question in the chat which I'll have a look at, but I'm going to open the floor. So we've got, is there a specific number of references that we need to use? Or is it something that doesn't matter as long as the reference is relevant or connected well to your range of claims? I'm not going to say that you should have a specific number, but obviously if you only reference 3 or 4, it means that you actually haven't looked widely. But in the same way, we don't want you to be peppering this proposal with 30 different references just to make it look like you've done lots of reading. So again, it's always about intentional. As you read one reference, you might find then that another one is referenced that you go and read and say, actually, that one is another one that's really important. Or you'll find authors who work in a particular field that you then go and read some of the other things that they're reading. So, for example, Kate de Bruyn's work, you might want to look at some of the different articles that she's written on MTSS. So I suggest if you pop your hand up if you've got a question, and I'll do my best to answer it.
I don't
I'll
know.
jump in if, oh, sorry.
Yeah, you go. I'll follow you.
Are you sure?
Go for it.
We both waited the same length of
I'll
time.
get you through. I'll get you to pop your hands up, and then if you've got a hand up again, I then know that you're like with the little reaction.
That'd be a good idea. Yes. All right. You've answered quite a few of the ones that I have on my little notes here, but I just had, can we do italics in our headings or no italics anywhere in the assessment?
I think normally you wouldn't use italics unless it's about referencing conventions.
Yeah. And bold, or just leave them as plain?
That's a good question. That is a good question. My intuition, so that's really bad in a science of learning subject, is that bold should be fine because you're making the heading clear, but I'm just going to write a note about that.
She hates bold. That'd be great. Or if anyone hates bold who's doing the marking, that would be great to know.
Yeah, I mean, I like bold because you
can see them.
Doesn't the APA have like a structure around headings and subheadings that you have to
I haven't
follow?
read that.
Yeah, I was about to say the same, Suzanne. If you Google up APA subheadings, there's like rules about where they go, middle, indented, or on the left, or what size, or bolded.
Okay.
And
I don't know what off by heart.
Yeah, and I think also though you're writing a proposal, so while you're doing academic writing, we're also using some things that are not like you're using first person. You're less likely to use first person in a different type of academic writing. So this is a persuasive piece, but yes, certainly go in and check what it says in there.
All right. And my only other one is how far into the application details do we go, or do we focus more, because it's only 3,000 words and you could easily do 10,000 words. So I'm just wondering, how deep down do we go into that application detail in our school setting?
I think part of that will depend on your context, because if you're already building on elements of MTS being in place, you perhaps have a slightly different focus. But the key thing is that there's a clear understanding of what MTSS is. So make sure that you're articulating that really well and bringing in the evidence base. And then about the different, the progress monitoring and what that might look like in your setting. And again, what would need to be put in, but also what are the outcomes that you're expecting in terms of academic achievement or positive behavior or, teacher satisfaction, for example.
Yep, that's perfect. So I'm framing it as in we aren't doing any sort of overarching thing like MTSS. So I'm coming at it from scratch. So I'm just going to explain it like that. Great.
But you could say that we have regular professional learning. So therefore we could tap into, that's a way that we can have an in.
Yeah.
We know perhaps that our staff work in teams, and teams is a really, teamwork is an important principle underlying MTSS.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Bronwyn, then Nicola.
Hi, Charlotte.
Hi.
I've got a few different questions. I'll start with the easiest one that might be easy to answer. So when I'm typing a sentence and I say, for example, at such and such a school, we should dum 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 dum, and that idea comes from research, if I then put that reference as a thing, the actual reference isn't referring, like that reference doesn't say, yes, this should be implemented at such and such a school.
No.
But is that okay in this situation?
Well, that's where you'd be perhaps saying there is a body of evidence that shows that when MTSS is implemented, these are the outcomes. And then you could reference. And then you could make the reference
Link it
to your
to,
school.
and therefore we should implement it.
And so this is one of my arguments for implementation of MTSS.
Okay, so basically scrap where I've put the we, like linked it, and just try and make it a little bit separate to this is the research, therefore we should implement it, or such and such.
Yeah, so what you're trying to say is yes, we currently or the most recent research shows this framework is for an underlying principle is all students can learn, and then you could put some references in there, and you could talk about the types of outcomes that you see. And then at our school, maybe it's one of the school values. You're looking at some of the values or the mission of the school. So it's about, in order to align with that, but also to align with what we know the evidence says.
Yeah.
I would like to propose that we implement MTSS. And in this proposal, I'm going to talk about what it is, why it's important, and how we might go about implementing it.
Okay, great. I came in at 30 seconds into it and you were talking about this background of the school. Are we to provide even one or two sentences for the markers about that it's a primary school, that it's in this part of Sydney, it has this much ESL, this many, is that relevant? Do you want any of that? And if so, is it in the word count?
You need to explain the context. I wouldn't go as far as saying which part of Sydney because you don't want things that identify, but you might say it's got a high SES, or you might say it's got a large refugee population, or it's got 600 students from foundation to year 6. So
it's sitting above it? Because obviously we know that the school council would know that, but we're trying to give a background. So can I just have a little paragraph at the top and say for the university markers, and then say a proposal such and such?
No, but what you might say is, this proposal is for school X, a primary school that has, so that you could start it by framing it like that. Because we know if it was actually going to, let's say it was Smith Primary School, this proposal has been put together for Smith Primary School. That's a foundation to year 6 school in regional New South Wales with 500 students and 20 staff across whatever, and it has composite class or it doesn't, whatever. So, and then move it in. So do you see, you still need to frame it even if it's for the leadership, because then what you can do is refer back to the context. So saying as a primary school, as a small primary school, as a primary school with 60 teachers, that's one of the considerations that we need to take into account when we're planning our professional learning or how we organise our teams. But definitely don't make a separate piece of information for the markers.
I have made a big start on it in the school holidays, and it's very difficult to keep it in word count. I've chosen not to have a literacy focus because I loved the idea of this multi-tiered minimum 3 domains. I loved that. I think that there's a lot of research to say they're interlinked. So I'm making a case to my school that we do all those domains. But just that we won't be marked down for not having a literacy focus.
You're not marked down for not having a literacy focus. I guess if you're in the language and literacy screen though, it might be useful to actually be referencing the literacy piece, because I understand where you're coming from to saying you love the whole idea of it. But if you're going to do implementation, where do you start? You can't start with just saying we're going to have an MTSS framework. I know from my own experience of implementation, you need to start with a small focus and
Okay.
then
So that is down to that's a lot of detail to then basically say, this is what it looks like. So I suggest we implement this first and then this and then this. That's very thorough.
But you might say, well, let's start at the tier one. Let's look at some universal screening. Let's look at what instructional practices are currently in place. Is there low variance? Does it depend on which class a student's in, which teacher they have? Or do we know that our teachers are already working together and they're making sure that if there's more than one class in a year level, that they're actually doing their planning? So I understand like 3,000 words actually isn't in one sense a lot of words, but if you say the broad context, then your context, and then why you need to implement and the things to take into account, you don't need to get right down to the real nitty gritty of exactly all the steps that you're going to do. But you do need to be able to have your leadership team to understand the whys, but also what they will need to consider in order to implement. So if you keep it really broad, they wouldn't know where to start.
But it is really big. And so that I thought the whole point was to say, if we're going to do it well, this is what it will entail. Yes, it might take 10 years to do, but this is the big picture.
Yeah.
That's how I've interpreted the assignment. But I think I'm getting the feeling like I've gone too big.
I think you definitely want to say, this is what we want to do, but you also need to give them to see what it can look like how's it going to start. So yes, this is MTS, these are the components. And for our context, it makes sense to start here. So perhaps let's look at what's happening in reading instruction. And let's look and see what happens what do we understand? What's the staff capacity? What do they understand about tier one? So then do we have any tier two supports already in place? So let's make sure that when we're talking about tier two support, we're talking about it within that RTI framework, which is under that MTSS umbrella.
Okay. My last question was just you were mentioning something about you'll need to explain the commitment that you're asking the school.
Oh, that's a suggestion, just to say it might be, and again, that depends on your context, but it might be saying we need the leadership to commit to this because when you've got those political visionaries, they'll do their best to remove the barriers and they'll provide you with the support. So it's about that type of commitment as well.
Yeah. Okay. And possibly a time frame? No.
Yeah, well, you might have a time frame. You might say initially, let's look at a 5-year period, and we would start off with whatever your focus is, and then build on from there. But obviously, it depends on it's being responsive as well. So you're looking to see how your teachers developing their skills. Can you actually move more quickly? Do you actually need to move more slowly?
Yeah. Okay, that's heaps of time. Thanks.
Thank you. Nicola.
Hi, Charlotte. You just said some really good stuff when you're talking about your headings and, going through with us what we needed to include. I'm just wondering, is there like a split in terms of the marks, like, 2/3 about an explanation of what MTSS is with a third, the intervention you've specifically chosen, or it's just how you, like, well, would it be a 50-50 split? I mean, I'm just getting a little bit more guidance in.
I'm just going to get up can you see the rubric now?
Yeah.
Because I think that will probably help. That you can see when you're being marked on the content knowledge, it's not about the split. It's about making sure that you've covered the key principles of MTSS. So that's where that comes in, rather than saying that there aren't certain number of marks allocated to the different types of knowledge, or the different areas.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And my second question is, I mean, I'm having a bit of difficulty narrowing down exactly what my intervention will be, but my school's doing reading really well, but writing's an area of focus. So then can I just focus on improving that, but mentioning tier one instruction, mentioning progress monitoring, mentioning, but applicable all to writing.
And that's where when you talk about the context, so you can say, as a school, we have implemented strong tier one instruction, high quality evidence-based reading instruction.
Yep.
So we've got some really good foundations to actually broaden our implementation of
Yep.
MTSS. And so that's where you would, again, you're linking it back to your context to say, so now we're ready to actually really focus on what's happening in writing and to learn from what we did when we were implementing reading. And again, referencing those elements, those components of MTS. So what happened with the professional learning? And it might be him saying, this was a great model that we used for our reading. So we would like to expand that, but how might our teams look?
Yep.
And then also project what might be next. And it might be how do we manage those tier two, or what do we do about universal screening, or what do we do about some of our diagnostic assessment, or how we progress monitor with writing.
Yes, okay, that would be great. Now, also mentioning that there's a little bit of overlap then there with my last assignment for 5008, which
Mhm.
was a presentation. Now, obviously not in like the MTSS RTI framework, but that was sort of the area I did focus on because it is relevant to my context. Is that okay? That I'll be doing a sort of a similar topic, I guess, just in a different question.
Yeah, I mean, what you're doing is hopefully as you put together that presentation, there was lots of learning from there, and you will be refining it as you go along.
Yes. Okay, then. And so it's okay then to reference, I guess, writing models that might have come up in 5007. Um, yeah.
Yeah. And we know that each person in this subject, well, not each person, some of you have got different pathways.
Starting in all different
Yes.
parts. Yeah.
Yeah, so some people, this is their first subject, and
Yep.
for others, you've done several other subjects. So that's one of the challenges, I guess, about knowing at the moment, because it's not a sequential set of subjects.
Yep.
It's knowing what prior knowledge do people have, and it's really quite varied. So therefore, if you're bringing some different prior knowledge, you can certainly tap into that for this assignment.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, well, what I might do is, just before I turn the recording off, I actually hope that you'll find the task useful, that it's not just something that's been created to test your knowledge, for you to demonstrate your knowledge. It will actually challenge you to articulate the concepts and the frameworks that you've been learning out in a way that is accessible. But if you can do that, then that's how you're demonstrating that you really understand the underlying principles, but also how that theory can actually be translated into practice. And that's what's really key. We also have made it a written task, because we know that when you write, it makes us think. Because what we're having to do is think of our ideas, how do you organize them, and then how do you take into account the audience so that they understand what's actually in our head, what learnings we've had as well. Again, I hope that it's something that's useful. It may not be a piece that you use like some of the past students, but it might be something that you come back to in the future and use it as your implementing or broadening implementation of MTSS.